Thomas Alexander Porter. On the night of October 28, 2005, a Norfolk police officer named Stanley Reeves stopped to ask a man a few routine questions. He never got his answers. Within moments, the officer was on the ground, shot 3 times in the head, and the man who pulled the trigger was already running north toward New York. What that man did in the years that followed, and what a single change in Virginia law did to his sentence, is the reason he now sits in a cell he is never expected to leave. Thomas Alexander Porter was already a man with a criminal history when that night began, someone who carried a gun and had run afoul of the law before. That is most of what mattered about who he was before he became a killer. The rest is what he did. It started with a phone call. A man named Reginald Copeland reported that someone was threatening women inside a Park Place apartment on Debris Avenue, and Officer Reeves responded to the scene. When he stopped Porter to question him, witnesses described what happened in a way that left little room for interpretation. Reeves was shot, he fell, and then he was shot twice more. He never had a chance to defend himself. Porter fled the state. He was tracked to New York and arrested, and it was there that investigators recovered something that would follow him into the courtroom. In a letter written from jail, Porter admitted in plain terms that he had robbed people in Park Place, and that when the officer arrived, he shot him because he believed there was a warrant out for his arrest. That letter turned a case built on eyewitnesses into a case built on his own words. At trial, Porter tried to reframe the killing as self-defense. Prosecutors rejected that outright, pointing back to what he had written himself, that he fired because he feared being taken in on a warrant. The jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. His appeals dragged on for years, and they centered less on whether he did it and more on who decided his fate. His lawyers argued that one of the jurors, a man whose brother served as a deputy sheriff, should never have been allowed to sit on a case about the killing of a police officer. The argument went nowhere. In August of 2020, a federal judge dismissed his appeal, and Porter's execution moved back into the realm of the possible. And then Virginia changed the rules entirely. On March 24, 2021, the Commonwealth abolished the death penalty. When it did, there were only 2 men left on Virginia's death row. Porter was one of them. The other was a convicted murderer named Anthony Juniper. In a single stroke of legislation, the sentences of both men were converted from death to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A spokeswoman for the Virginia Department of Corrections, Lisa Kinney, laid out where the 2 men would go. She described Porter as the man who had murdered a police officer for trying to stop and question him, and she confirmed that he was being transferred to Red Onion State Prison, while Juniper was sent to Wallens Ridge. Porter has been held at Red Onion since that transfer. To put it simply, the very law that spared Thomas Porter from the electric chair is the same law that guaranteed he would spend every remaining day of his life inside one of the most restrictive prisons in the country. He avoided execution, but he traded it for a cell in the mountains of Wise County with no release date and no way out. For the family of Stanley Reeves, there was no dramatic reversal, no comfort in the change of sentence, only the permanence of the loss. A uniformed officer who stopped to do the most ordinary part of his job, asking a man a question, was gone, and the man responsible would grow old behind concrete and steel rather than face the punishment a jury once handed down. That is the strange arithmetic of Porter's case. His life was extended, and his freedom was ended in the same instant. And both happened because of a law he had nothing to do with writing. He remains at Red Onion today, a former death row inmate serving out a sentence that will only end when his life does. Porter's road to Red Onion was built entirely by what he did on the outside. One violent night on a Norfolk street. But the next man on this list didn't earn his place here through a crime committed on any street corner. He was already a prisoner, already counting down the years until his release, when he made a choice inside a state facility that erased any future he had left. John Holloman Russell. Here is a man who was, by the calendar, almost done. John Holloman Russell was serving a sentence of 11 years and 11 months, the kind of stretch that has an end you can actually see, with a release date that would have landed him back in the free world before the end of the decade. Instead, on a single day in November of 2025, he did something that took that release date and replaced it with a courtroom, a capital charge, and a transfer to the one prison built to hold the men the system fears most. Russell was 32 years old and housed at River North Correctional Center, a medium-security prison in Grayson County, Virginia. The sentence that had put him there was a patchwork of separate offenses, a carjacking out of Fairfax, the use of a firearm, and a shoplifting charge from Albemarle, all of it adding up to a term that would have run into 2029. He was, in other words, a man with a countdown. And then he threw it away. On November 17, 2025, Russell attacked staff inside River North. In the violence that followed, he killed a corrections officer named Jeremy Lewis Hall and injured 2 others. Jeremy Hall was 40 years old. He had joined the Virginia Department of Corrections in April of 2024, meaning he had worn the uniform for barely more than a year and a half. According to reports of what happened that day, Hall died protecting a nurse who was also inside the facility. That single detail tells you most of what you need to know about the kind of officer he was. He was not the only one hurt. 2 other officers were injured in the same attack, caught up in a burst of violence inside a facility that was supposed to be one of the more controlled environments in the state system. River North is a medium-security prison, not a supermax, which means the men housed there are generally considered a lower risk than those sent to places like Red Onion. That assumption is part of what makes the killing so jarring. Russell was not classified as one of the most dangerous inmates in Virginia. He simply became one in the space of a few minutes, and a corrections officer with a year and a half on the job paid for it with his life. The response from the Commonwealth was swift and unusually direct. On December 19, 2025, a Grayson County grand jury returned an indictment that stacked the most serious charges Virginia has to offer. Russell was charged with 1 count of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, 1 count of aggravated malicious wounding, and 1 count of malicious wounding. In Virginia, aggravated murder is a Class 1 felony, and it carries the possibility of a life sentence. The legal process that followed was not entirely smooth. At one point, Russell entered a guilty plea, and then he withdrew it, which is why the case remained active heading into early 2026. But regardless of how the plea negotiations played out, the practical consequence had already arrived. After the killing, Russell was moved out of River North and transferred to Red Onion State Prison, where he is currently held. The officials who spoke about the case did not soften their language. The director of the Virginia Department of Corrections, Chad Dotson, publicly thanked the prosecutors who pursued the charges, describing the killing of Master Corrections Officer Jeremy Lewis Hall as unspeakable. Governor Glenn Youngkin offered a blessing for the men and women who put their lives on the line every day working for the state's correction system. A reminder that the people who guard the prisons are exposed to the same violence they are meant to contain. Think about the math of Russell's decision for a moment. He was serving a sentence measured in single digits of years. Now he sits in a supermax facility facing a Class 1 felony, the kind of charge that ends any conversation about a release date. He turned a countdown into a life sentence, and he did it inside a building surrounded by guards, cameras, and locked doors. That is what makes his case different from the men who arrive at Red Onion after a crime on the outside. Russell was already inside the system when he committed the act that will define the rest of his life. The prison did not fail to catch him. It was the scene of the crime. The case was still moving through the courts as of early 2026, but the essential facts were no longer in dispute. A veteran corrections officer was dead, killed while shielding a nurse, and the man responsible had already been delivered to the prison from which he is not expected to return. Russell's crime happened behind prison walls, which is what sets him apart. But the next man built his path to Red Onion in the open, across 2 college towns and 5 long years, leaving 2 families searching for daughters who went out one night and never came home. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. 2 young women vanished 5 years apart in 2 different Virginia cities after 2 ordinary nights out. One was a Virginia Tech student who disappeared after a Metallica concert. The other was a University of Virginia freshman who walked away from a downtown mall and was never seen alive again. For years, the cases sat separately, 2 tragedies with no obvious thread between them. And then a fragment of DNA connected them to the same man, and the full shape of what he had been doing finally came into view. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. was a large, physically imposing man who had drifted through jobs and campuses across central Virginia. That physical presence is the detail that matters most in his story, because it appears again and again in the accounts of what he did to the women he targeted. The first known case in the chain actually predates the disappearances. On September 24, 2005, in Fairfax City, Matthew grabbed a 26-year-old woman as she walked home from a grocery store on Germantown Road. He dragged her behind a maintenance shed, choked her, and sexually assaulted her. She survived, and crucially, she survived carrying evidence, because DNA recovered from beneath her fingernails would later become the link that tied everything together. Then came the disappearances. On October 17, 2009, 20-year-old Morgan Harrington vanished after a Metallica concert at Charlottesville's John Paul Jones Arena. Her remains were found on a farm the following January. 5 years later, on September 13, 2014, 18-year-old Hannah Graham disappeared from the downtown mall in Charlottesville. Her remains were found that October. The disappearance of Hannah Graham became one of the largest search efforts the Charlottesville area had ever seen. Volunteers combed fields and woodlands. Surveillance footage from the downtown mall was pored over frame by frame, and the case drew national attention for weeks. It was that intense scrutiny that finally caught up with Matthew, and once investigators had his DNA, the pieces of a much longer history began to fall into place. The same genetic profile connected him not only to Graham, but backward in time to Morgan Harrington and to the Fairfax survivor who had fought him off years earlier. A case that had looked like a single missing college student suddenly stretched across half a decade. When Matthew was finally arrested and the DNA evidence aligned, the scope of what he admitted was staggering. He acknowledged abducting both young women with the intent to defile them and murdering them. Reporting on the case described the brutal force he used, including breaking their bones. These were not crimes of opportunity that spiraled. They were predatory abductions carried out years apart by a man who had already shown, in that 2005 assault, exactly what he was capable of. The legal reckoning came in stages. In June of 2015, Matthew was convicted in the Fairfax City case and received 3 life sentences. Then, on March 2, 2016, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and abduction, with intent to defile in the cases of both Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington. For those crimes, he was given 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, stacked on top of everything else. The words of the mothers left behind cut deeper than any sentence. Hannah Graham's mother, Susan, described how Matthew had discarded her daughter's body, saying he had left her like a bag of garbage to be picked over by buzzards. It is one of the most devastating things a parent can say about what was done to their child. Morgan Harrington's mother, Gil, took a different path when she later learned that Matthew had been diagnosed with cancer in prison. She wondered aloud whether this was simply the next phase of his justice, perhaps his karma finally arriving. And that cancer diagnosis is the reason Matthew's connection to Red Onion is confirmed, but no longer current. He was housed at Red Onion State Prison for a period, held among the highest security population in the state. Around 2019, he was transferred to Sussex One State Prison so that he could receive treatment for his illness. His time at Red Onion is a documented fact, even though his medical needs eventually moved him elsewhere within the same closed system. What makes Matthew's case so unsettling is the patience of it. 5 years passed between Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham. Nearly a decade passed between the Fairfax assault and Graham's murder. A predator that methodical does not stop on his own. It took a single strand of DNA under a survivor's fingernails, evidence she fought to leave behind, to finally close the gap and connect a string of crimes that had spanned years and cities. Matthew will spend the rest of his life in Virginia's prison system, carrying multiple life sentences with no release date and no appeal that can change the outcome. 2 families lost daughters. A 3rd woman survived and became the reason he was caught. And a man who moved through college towns like a shadow was finally pinned to every crime he thought he had gotten away with. Matthew took the lives of young women in the open air of 2 college towns. The next man's crime also happened outside, on a quiet street before dawn, and it began with the most routine call a small-town officer can answer. Michael Donovan White. It was supposed to be a welfare check. Around 4 in the morning on November 13, 2021, a police officer in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, drove out to a house on Orr Street to make sure everything was all right. It was also his 29th birthday. By the end of that day, Officer Michael Chandler was dead, and the man who killed him had fired 8 shots through a car window and fled into the dark. What happened to that killer afterward is where the story takes a turn that even the video's title can only half explain. Michael Donovan White was 33 years old and came from Cross, South Carolina. What defined him on the night of the killing was a single, chilling priority: that he was not going back to jail, no matter what it cost. Officer Chandler arrived at the house on Orr Street responding to that early morning call. White was there with a co-defendant named Misty Ward, and by his own instructions to her, there were drugs in the car. He told her to leave, telling her plainly that he was not going back behind bars. When his own car got stuck in the grass and Chandler approached, White opened fire. He fired 8 rounds from a 9mm pistol through the driver's window, striking Chandler in the wrist and in the abdomen, below the protection of his vest. Chandler managed to return fire before he fell. He died that evening. The image of that morning is hard to shake. A young officer, alone, approaching a car stuck in the grass on a routine call, unaware that the man inside had already decided he would rather kill than be arrested again. Chandler was struck below his vest, in the one place the armor could not protect, and even as he fell, he managed to fire back. He held on for the rest of the day before he died. It was his 29th birthday. White ran. He was tracked across the state line and captured in Kingsport, Tennessee, and it was in the aftermath of his arrest that he revealed exactly who he was. Upon being taken into custody, he said he should have shot the others too. In recorded jail calls, he expressed no remorse whatsoever, saying the officer had known the risk when he picked up a gun and a badge, that he had known he could die. There was no flicker of regret, only a cold accounting of another man's death. The justice system answered with the full weight of two separate governments. White faced both federal and state charges, and he lost on every front. In May of 2024, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder at the state level, and he was convicted on 8 federal counts as well. In February of 2025, a federal court in Abingdon sentenced him to 100 years. The following month, in March of 2025, a Wise County court added another 100 years of active time. 200 years total. That is not a typo, by the way. His sentences run past any conceivable human lifespan several times over. The Commonwealth's attorney, Brett Hall, summed it up without any softening. He said they now knew for certain that Michael White would die behind bars, that he would die alone and cold in a box. It was a blunt promise, and the paperwork backs it up. Now, here is where accuracy has to override the easy version of the story. White is popularly described as a man on his way to Red Onion State Prison, and that framing has followed his case around. But the available evidence points somewhere else. A newspaper photo caption from Kingsport indicated that after his state sentencing in March of 2025, White was escorted to return to federal prison, which fits the fact that he was convicted on federal counts and carries a 100-year federal term. No reviewed record actually places him inside Red Onion. So the honest version is this: Michael White may end up in Red Onion, and he is often talked about as though he is already headed there. But as things stand, he appears to be in federal custody serving out that first century of his sentence. The Red Onion destination is a claim, not a confirmed fact, and a channel that cares about getting things right has to say so plainly. What is not in question is the outcome. Whether the walls around him belong to the federal system or to a Virginia supermax, Michael White will die inside them. 200 years leaves no room for anything else. Officer Michael Chandler was killed on his own birthday, doing the quietest kind of police work there is, and the man who killed him showed the world he felt nothing about it. White's remorselessness is hard to sit with, but at least his violence stopped at a single killing. The next man on this list did not just kill once. He killed on the outside, and then he kept killing after the prison doors had already closed behind him. Robert Charles Gleason, Jr. Condemned men almost always spend their final years fighting the state to stay alive. Robert Charles Gleason, Jr. fought for the opposite. He killed a man to cover up a drug operation, and then, once he was already serving life, he killed twice more. Inside the prisons meant to contain him, murdering 2 fellow inmates in the span of about a year. And when he was finally sentenced to death for it, he waved off his own appeals and demanded to be executed, warning that if the state kept him alive, he would simply keep killing. In 2013, Virginia granted his request. Robert Gleason was born in April of 1970 in Lowell, Massachusetts, and by his adult years, he was running a methamphetamine operation in Virginia. That criminal enterprise is the seed of everything that followed, because the first killing was about protecting it. On May 8, 2007, in a wooded area off Route 130 in Amherst County, Gleason shot a 53-year-old truck driver named Michael Kent Jamerson 4 times, twice in the head and twice in the torso, to silence him and cover up the drug ring. He used Jamerson's own pistol. Before he pulled the trigger, he reportedly told the man that today was the day to get right with God. A turkey hunter later found the body. Gleason was convicted and in 2008 sentenced to life in prison. That should have been the end of the danger he posed. It was only the beginning. On May 8, 2009, exactly 2 years to the day after he murdered Jamerson, Gleason killed again. This time the victim was his own cellmate at Wallens Ridge State Prison, a mentally impaired 63-year-old man named Harvey Gray Watson, Jr. Gleason bound him, beat him, gagged him, and strangled him. And here is the detail that turns a prison murder into an indictment of the prison itself. The guards did not notice the body for roughly 15 hours. 15 hours. A man was killed inside a state facility, and his death went unnoticed for the better part of a day. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Gleason was moved to Red Onion State Prison to await sentencing for that second killing, and it was there, on July 28, 2010, that he committed his third murder. His victim was a 26-year-old inmate named Aaron Alexander Cooper, who was serving time for carjacking and robbery. Gleason fashioned a noose from braided bedsheet threads and worked it through the chain-link fence that separated their recreation cages. What he did next is almost too methodical to describe as a single act. He strangled Cooper, revived him, and strangled him again, drawing the killing out. It happened at Red Onion, the very prison built to prevent exactly this kind of violence. By now the pattern was undeniable. 3 men dead across 3 years, 1 on the outside and 2 inside prison walls, and Gleason showing no sign of stopping. He was sentenced to death in September of 2011. And then he did something almost no condemned man does. He waived his appeals and pushed for his own execution to be carried out, stating outright that if he was kept alive, he would kill again. He treated it as a promise, not a threat. Virginia took him at his word. On January 16, 2013, Robert Gleason was executed in the electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center, pronounced dead at 9:08 in the evening. He was the first person executed anywhere in the United States that year. He was also the last person to die in an electric chair in any American jurisdiction for nearly 6 years afterward. His final words were a strange, defiant send-off, asking to be put on the highway to Jackson, calling out a goodbye to his Irish friends in Gaelic, and ending with a blessing. Gleason's connection to Red Onion is not a matter of where he was housed for the long term. It is the site of one of his murders, a killing he carried out while already inside the walls, already condemned in all but the paperwork. He is the rare figure on this list who is no longer alive to serve his sentence, because he insisted the state carry out the ultimate one. He did not want to grow old in a cell. He wanted the chair, and he made sure he got it. If a man who talked his way into his own execution feels like the darkest possible name on a list like this, hold that thought. Because the men still ahead of us include a killer who opened fire on a bus full of college athletes, a father who ended the life of his own infant son for an insurance payout, and a quiet political outsider who hunted prominent residents of an entire city from their own front doorsteps. If this is the kind of case that keeps you watching, then hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it makes sure the next one lands on your feed. Kevin Rashid Johnson. He was convicted of murder at 18 years old and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. But over the 3 decades that followed, he became something the Virginia prison system never set out to create. He taught himself law from inside a solitary cell and filed lawsuit after lawsuit against the very institution holding him, wrote books that circulated far beyond the walls, and turned himself into one of the most closely watched prisoners in the state. He insists to this day that he did not commit the crime that put him there. And whether or not you believe him, his connection to Red Onion is more thoroughly documented than almost anyone else on this list. Kevin Johnson, who is widely known by the name Rashid, was born in October of 1971 in Richmond, Virginia. Before his conviction, he was a young drug dealer, and that is most of what the public record establishes about the life he led before prison swallowed the rest of it. In 1990, at the age of 18, he was convicted of murder and handed a life sentence. Here, the story requires some care, because the details of that original case are genuinely disputed and thinly documented in the public record. Johnson has always maintained that he is innocent. He argues that he was misidentified and that his conviction rested largely on the word of a police informant. The identity and circumstances of the victim in that 1990 case are not clearly established in the available sources, and an honest telling has to leave that gap open rather than fill it with invention. What is not in dispute is the sentence he received, and what he did with the decades that followed. Inside, Johnson became an organizer and a writer. He was a founding member and the self-described Minister of Defense of the new African Black Panther Party, and he later helped found a related organization called the Revolutionary Intercommunal Black Panther Party. He joined a prisoners' labor group, and he authored 2 books from behind bars, one called Defying the Tomb, published in 2010, and another called Panther Vision, published in 2015. His writing turned him into a recognizable name among prison reform activists across the country. By his own account, and according to his official biography, Johnson has spent something in the neighborhood of 18 years in solitary confinement. 18 years. That is not a typo, by the way. He says he used that time to study law, and the record of lawsuits he has filed against the prison system supports the claim that he learned to use the courts as a weapon. He has been transferred again and again, bounced between prisons in Virginia, Oregon, Texas, Florida, Ohio, and South Carolina, and he says those transfers tended to follow his efforts to expose conditions inside. He has also said he suffers from prostate cancer that went neglected. Those accounts of abuse and neglect come largely from his own writing and from advocacy outlets, so they are best understood as his claims rather than settled fact. His ties to Red Onion, though, are extensively recorded. From 1995 to 2012, Johnson was held at Wallens Ridge and Red Onion state prisons in varying degrees of isolation. He returned to Red Onion in June of 2018 and again on the 30th of October, 2023. He took part in a hunger strike that began the day after Christmas in 2023, a protest aimed squarely at the use of long-term solitary confinement. And when a crisis unfolded at Red Onion in September of 2024, in which multiple men reportedly set themselves on fire, Johnson was one of the people documenting and reporting on it from the inside. An attorney with a group called Rights Behind Bars, Miriam Nemeth, described the situation to a Virginia public radio station in stark terms. She said they were hearing accounts of conditions so unbearable that men had set themselves ablaze simply to be removed from the facility. It is the kind of claim that sounds impossible until you sit with the fact that people were making it at all. As of the years spanning 2024 into 2026, Johnson has continued to be shuffled between prison systems, including a stint in South Carolina under an interstate agreement, but he remains a Virginia lifer with no release on the horizon. His case is unusual on this list precisely because the crime itself sits under a question mark, while his life sentence and his long residency inside Red Onion are matters of record. He is a man who turned confinement into a career of resistance, and who will, barring something extraordinary, die inside the system he spent his life fighting. Kevin Johnson's decades inside were defined by paperwork, protest, and a war of attrition with the courts. The next man's path to a life sentence took only a matter of seconds, and it unfolded in front of dozens of witnesses who thought they were simply riding a bus home. Christopher Darnell Jones, Jr. On a November afternoon in 2022, a charter bus rolled back onto the University of Virginia campus, carrying students home from a class field trip. Most of them were tired, half asleep, ready to be done with the long ride. And then one of their own classmates, a young man who had once been a member of the university's football team, stood up and opened fire inside that bus. He killed 3 student athletes and wounded 2 more people before slipping away into the night. It took roughly 12 hours to find him. It would take 3 years to sentence him, and when the sentence finally came, it was the harshest the law would allow. Christopher Darnell Jones, Jr. was a former UVA football player, and that connection to the team is what makes the crime so hard to comprehend, because the young men he killed were his teammates and classmates. On the 13th of November, 2022, as about 27 students returned from a trip to Washington to see a play about the murder of Emmett Till, Jones opened fire inside the Culbreth garage on campus. Then he fled. He was arrested about 12 hours later in Henrico County. Those 12 hours were their own kind of nightmare. The university issued a shelter-in-place order, and thousands of students spent the night locked in dorm rooms and campus buildings, phones lighting up with warnings, not knowing whether the shooter was still nearby. Parents across the country watched the news and tried to reach their children. For a campus that had just sent students off on an ordinary class trip, the sudden shift into a lockdown and a fugitive search was almost impossible to process. When Jones was finally taken into custody the next morning, the immediate danger was over, but the grief was only beginning to set in. The 3 young men he killed were all football players with lives just beginning to take shape. Devin Chandler was 20, a wide receiver from North Carolina, whose teammates called him the dancing machine for the joy he brought to a room. Lavelle Davis Jr. was also 20, a towering wide receiver from South Carolina who stood 6'7" and had already earned freshman All-American recognition, and who helped lead a campus social justice group. Deshaun Perry was 22, a linebacker from Miami who was also an artist and a musician, studying studio art. All 3 would later receive posthumous degrees from the university. 2 others, a running back named Mike Hollins and a student named Marley Morgan, were wounded and survived. For 2 years, the case moved through the system, and in November of 2024, Jones pleaded guilty. He admitted to 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated malicious wounding, and 5 counts of using a firearm. That plea set the stage for a sentencing hearing that would stretch into the following year. On the 21st of November, 2025, Judge Cheryl Higgins handed down the maximum. Jones received 5 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 23 years. His defense had asked for mercy, describing an abusive childhood and arguing that he suffered from paranoid delusions. Jones himself apologized in court, and he told the room that he had never asked for anything less than a life sentence for what he had done. The judge was careful about how she framed the punishment. She said the sentence was not meant to be vindictive, but that the facts of the case genuinely merited spending the rest of his life in prison. And one of the survivors spoke in a way that cut past the legal language entirely. Mike Hollins, the running back who had been shot and lived, said that no amount of time on earth could heal the pain or bring those lives back, but that there was at least a small measure of peace in knowing the man who did it would never be able to hurt anyone else again. Now here the same accuracy problem arises that we saw earlier with Michael White. Jones is often described as a man headed for Red Onion, and it is a natural assumption given the severity of his sentence. But no reviewed news report or public record actually names the facility where he was sent after that November 2025 sentencing. His placement simply has not been publicly confirmed, and a channel that takes accuracy seriously has to say that plainly rather than assert something it cannot back up. What is beyond dispute is the outcome for Jones himself. 5 consecutive life terms leave no room for release. Wherever the Virginia system houses him, he will not walk free again. 3 young athletes who boarded a bus expecting to go home never did, and the classmate who killed them will spend the rest of his life accounting for it. The students Jones killed were young adults, their futures only beginning to open up. The next victim on this list never got the chance to grow up at all, and the person responsible was the one who was supposed to protect him most. Joaquin Shadow Rams. On a single afternoon in October of 2012, a 15-month-old boy was dropped off at his father's home in Manassas, Virginia, for one of the first unsupervised visits a court had ever permitted. He never came home. His mother had pleaded with the court not to allow those visits, convinced that something terrible would happen. And when investigators began to ask why a healthy toddler had suddenly died, they uncovered a trail of insurance paperwork that pointed toward a motive as cold as anything on this list. The man at the center of the case was born John Anthony Ramirez in New York in 1972, though he went by the name Joaquin Shadow Rams. The child was his own son, Prince McLeod Rams, just 15 months old. On the 20th of October, 2012, during only the 4th court-ordered unsupervised visit, Prince's life was taken while he was in his father's care. In keeping with the sensitivity this case demands, the specifics of how a 15-month-old came to die will not be detailed here. What matters is what the investigation and the court ultimately concluded, which is that this was no accident. Rams claimed that the boy had died from a fever-induced seizure. The judge who heard the case rejected that explanation entirely. The reason investigators looked so hard is where the case turns truly disturbing. In September of 2011, roughly a year before the child died, Rams had taken out life insurance policies on the infant totaling more than $500,000. Put plainly, he had insured a baby's life for over $500,000, and about a year later, that baby was dead. Prosecutors argued the motive was exactly what it looked like. The child's mother, Hera McLeod, had seen the danger coming. She had fled the relationship with Rams just 2 weeks after her son was born, and she had fought, without success, to stop the court from granting unsupervised visits because she feared for the boy's safety. Years earlier, she had summed up her read on Rams in a single chilling observation, saying that either he was the most unlucky man on the planet, or he was a killer. McLeod's fight in family court is one of the most agonizing parts of the whole story. She had raised her fears about Rams directly, and the system had still moved, step by step, toward giving him time alone with the child. By the time of that fourth unsupervised visit, a mother who had done everything she could think of to protect her son found herself legally required to hand him over. When the worst happened, it happened during a visit the court itself had authorized over her objections, a detail that would haunt the case long after the verdict. That line carried extra weight because Prince was not the only suspicious death in Rams's orbit. Investigators had questions about the death of his former girlfriend, Sean Mason, back in 2003, and about the death of his own mother, Alma Collins, in 2008. Both of those deaths, like the child's, were connected to insurance money. It is important to be precise here, though. Rams was never charged or convicted in either of those earlier deaths, and they remain only suspicions that investigators raised, not established facts. The case against him in his son's death went to a bench trial rather than a jury. Rams waived his right to a jury in exchange for prosecutors agreeing to take the death penalty off the table. On the 13th of April, 2017, a Fairfax County Circuit Court judge named Randy Bellows found him guilty of capital murder, laying out his reasoning in a 62-page ruling that he read aloud from the bench. That August, Rams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. Judge Bellows did not mince words about the nature of the crime. He described it as cold, calculating, and callous, and he called its impact shattering. Coming from a judge who had just spent 62 pages methodically working through the evidence, that assessment landed with real force. As for where Rams is held, the record points to Red Onion State Prison, and as of 2025 he remained in Virginia Department of Corrections custody, serving out his sentence. He is one of the rare men on this list whose victim was utterly defenseless, an infant who depended on him completely, and whose life he is accused of trading for an insurance payout he never got to collect. The money that supposedly motivated the whole scheme was never paid out. In the end, all his planning bought him was a capital murder conviction and a cell he will occupy until he dies. Rams killed for money, and he chose the most helpless victim a person could choose. The next man killed for something harder to pin down, a slow-burning grudge he carried for more than a decade against an entire city and the people he decided represented it. Charles Severance. For more than 10 years, 3 well-known residents of Alexandria, Virginia, were shot to death inside their own homes, in daylight, answering their own front doors. For a long time, nobody connected the killings to one another. One victim's husband, who happened to be the county sheriff, spent years under a shadow of suspicion for a murder he had nothing to do with, and he died still carrying that weight. The man actually responsible turned out to be a failed political candidate who had spent years nursing a grudge against everyone he believed had looked down on him. Charles Severance had run for mayor of Alexandria twice and lost, and he had come to see the city's prominent citizens as an elite class that had wronged him, a resentment that reportedly hardened after he lost a custody battle over his own child. Over roughly 11 years, he acted on that resentment 3 times, and each time he chose a victim who represented the kind of establishment figure he despised. The first was Nancy Dunning, a real estate agent, and the wife of the man who was then the city sheriff, James Dunning. She was shot in December of 2003. For years afterward, suspicion hung over her husband, and he died before the truth came out, which is a particular kind of injustice. And somehow, it gets worse, because while an innocent man carried that suspicion to his grave, The real killer was still out there, and still not finished. The second victim was Ronald Kirby, a respected transportation planner, shot inside his home in November of 2013, nearly a decade after Nancy Dunning. The third was Ruth Ann Lodato, a 59-year-old music teacher who came from a family of Alexandria judges. She was shot in February of 2014. In her case, there was a witness. Her caregiver was wounded in the same attack, but survived, and she was able to help identify the man responsible. All three victims had been shot at their front doors with a small-caliber handgun in the middle of the day, in quiet residential neighborhoods where that kind of violence was almost unthinkable. The fact that these three killings went unconnected for so long is part of what makes the case so unnerving. They were spread across more than a decade in a city where such crimes were rare, and there was no obvious thread linking a real estate agent, a transportation planner, and a music teacher. What tied them together was not a visible pattern, but a single furious mind that saw all three as symbols of the same enemy. For years, the people of Alexandria did not even realize they were living inside the same story, that one person was moving among them and selecting targets according to a private logic no one else could follow. When investigators finally did connect the shootings, the realization sent a wave of fear through a community that had assumed these were separate, unrelated tragedies. Once the cases were finally linked and Severance was arrested, the evidence against him came together, and the trial was moved to Fairfax County on a change of venue. In November of 2015, a jury convicted him. He was found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder for the killings of Kirby and Lodato, 1 count of first-degree murder for the killing of Dunning, and a string of related charges, 10 counts in all. He was sentenced to 3 life terms, plus an additional 48 years. Prosecutors had chosen not to seek the death penalty. The words spoken around the verdict captured the mix of relief and fury that the case left behind. One of the prosecutors, an assistant attorney general named James Entus, remarked that it was fitting the jury had deliberated over the Halloween holiday because they had delivered justice to a monster. The daughter of Nancy Dunning, Liz, spoke to the sheer length of the ordeal, noting down to the day how long it had been since her mother was murdered. 11 years, 10 months, and 28 days. And the local prosecutor, Brian Porter, would later say that Severance had wanted his killings to be terrifying, that the fear was part of the point. Severance's exact current facility is not explicitly confirmed in the sources reviewed for this case. What is documented is that he is a Virginia lifer, held somewhere in the state's Department of Corrections, with 3 life sentences and no path to release. Whether or not the specific walls around him belong to Red Onion, the outcome is the same. A man who terrorized a city from its own doorsteps and who let an innocent man take the blame for years will die in prison. Severance was a man whose grip on reality was arguable, but whose planning was meticulous and deliberate. The final name on this list is almost his mirror image, a young man so severed from reality that the state eventually decided it could not, in good conscience, put him to death. Percy LeVar Walton. Over the course of about 10 days in November of 1996, a teenager in Danville, Virginia, killed 3 of his neighbors, robbed them, and was sentenced to die for it. But he never reached the execution chamber. Because the closer the state came to carrying out that sentence, the harder it became to ignore what the young man on death row actually believed. He was convinced, apparently in earnest, that his own execution would bring his victims back to life, and that afterward he would be able to go get something to eat at a fast food restaurant. And no, that is not an exaggeration for effect. Percy LeVar Walton was born in October of 1978 and he was just 18 years old when he committed the killings. Over roughly a week and a half, he took the lives of 3 people who lived near him. 2 were an elderly married couple, Jesse Kendrick, who was 80, and Elizabeth Kendrick, who was 81. The third was a 33-year-old neighbor named Archie Moore, Jr. Walton robbed his victims, and he was seen afterward driving a car that had belonged to Moore. In 1997, Walton pleaded guilty to a long list of charges, including 4 counts of capital murder, 3 counts of robbery, a burglary count, and 6 firearm counts. He was sentenced to death. On paper, it was a straightforward capital case. A young man who had killed 3 people in cold blood over a matter of days. But as the years passed and his execution dates approached, a very different picture emerged. Walton was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He scored a 66 on an IQ test. Corrections staff had taken to calling him by a nickname that reflected how detached he seemed from the world around him. And his beliefs about what his own execution would accomplish were, by any measure, completely disconnected from reality. He did not appear to grasp that death was permanent, either for his victims or for himself. That created a genuine constitutional problem. The United States Supreme Court has long held that the state cannot execute a person who lacks a rational understanding of why he is being put to death. And the more closely Walton's competency was examined, the clearer it became that he did not meet that standard. His execution was stayed more than once, as the legal questions mounted. Each of those stays came with its own drama. Execution dates were set, preparations began, and then, as the machinery of the death chamber drew closer, courts and officials intervened to halt it. Mental health experts examined Walton repeatedly, and the reports painted a consistent picture of a man who could not meaningfully comprehend his situation. The case drew attention from advocates who argued that carrying out the sentence would amount to executing someone for a crime he could no longer rationally connect to the punishment. It became one of those cases that forces a state to confront the limits of its own power, the point at which a legally valid death sentence collides with a defendant whose mind cannot grasp what is happening to him. The matter finally landed on the desk of Virginia's governor at the time, Tim Kaine. On the 9th of June, 2008, Kaine commuted Walton's death sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In explaining the decision, Kaine said that commuting the sentence to life without parole had become the only constitutionally appropriate course of action available to him. But he was careful to add that he remained mindful of the terrible injustice Walton had inflicted on Jesse Kendrick, Elizabeth Kendrick, and Archie Moore. The commutation was not a statement about guilt. It was a statement about what the Constitution would and would not permit the state to do to a man in Walton's condition. From there, Walton disappeared into the part of the prison system built for inmates like him. He was moved to a treatment center within the Virginia Department of Corrections designed for the mentally ill. And this is where his case parts ways with the premise that brought him onto this list. Because as of 2025, Percy Walton is not held at Red Onion. He is housed at Greensville Correctional Center. His placement is a reminder that these designations shift over time, and that the men who will never leave their cells are not all held behind the same set of walls. What does not shift is the permanence of his situation. Walton escaped the execution chamber, but only by trading it for a life sentence he will serve until he dies, inside a facility built to manage a mind that never fully understood what it had done. The commutation spared his life, yet it closed the door on any possibility of freedom just as firmly as an execution would have. He remains in Virginia custody today, and there is no legal path that leads him back out. Every one of these men will die behind bars, in a cell they will never leave. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.